Imagine it's 2024 and UK trade is spiraling. But what if we told you that there was only one massive culprit behind this entire mess? Brexit was meant to bring newfound independence to the UK, but instead it's tangled up in chaos. It left us wondering, was the UK really better off alone? Several things have gone wrong over the last 8 years, and the UK's trade has almost completely collapsed. But can all this damage be reversed? First, let's try to understand the extent of this damage. So when the UK and the EU agreed on a post-Brexit deal, the trade and cooperation agreement, many hoped it would smooth things over. But here's the twist. It brought it many new obstacles. Instead of making trade easier, it slapped on extra checks and rules that made trading with the EU much harder. This wasn't about taxes, but these non-tariff barriers, like more paperwork, longer waits, and stricter rules, piled up fast. Since 2019, trade between the UK and the EU has taken a hit, and it continued to be a problem in 2024. UK exports to the EU dropped by around 9%, while imports from the EU fell by 18%. And this drop isn't just because of less demand, it's because of those pesky barriers. First come the non-tariff barriers. Think of these as massive inconvenient hurdles. They're not obvious taxes, but rather a maze of rules and steps that slow things down. After Brexit, UK businesses had to start dealing with customs checks, product inspections, and certification processes that didn't exist before. This means more paperwork, more delays, and more money spent. The UK's Office for Budget Responsibility even projected that trade would shrink by 15% over time just because of these increased trade barriers. And it's not just about trade numbers, it affects everything, from how fast goods move to the number of jobs in certain sectors. Think about it. Before Brexit, goods moved pretty seamlessly between the UK and the EU, almost like passing from one town to another. But now, each truck carrying goods across the border has to go through new customs checks. This has led to extra forms, slower movement, and more costs for businesses. Small businesses in particular are feeling the pinch because they can't absorb these new costs as easily as bigger companies. And it doesn't stop there. The UK and EU no longer have the same rules for certain products. This means that UK businesses exporting to the EU must ensure their products meet EU standards, which often means extra compliance checks and, you guessed it, more money out of their pockets. Regulatory differences may sound dull, but for businesses, they're a big deal, adding up to more costs and cutting into profits. These changes aren't just theoretical. According to the UK's Office for National Statistics, UK exports to the EU were down by around £0.1 billion in June 2024 compared to the previous year. Imports from the EU also saw a decrease, dropping by £1.5 billion. And if we zoom out, in 2023, UK exports to the EU accounted for about 42% of all UK exports. That's still a lot, but it's still lower than in previous years, showing a real dip in trade volume. Some industries have been hit especially hard. Take the UK's car industry, for example. Car production in the UK dropped by over 7% in just the first half of 2024. Even more striking, car exports to the EU fell nearly 14%. With all the new barriers, supply chains got disrupted and costs skyrocketed, making it even harder to compete. Now, there's another angle to this problem. When the United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union, it wasn't just saying goodbye to political ties, it also meant losing access to a huge network of trade agreements that the EU had in place with other countries. As part of the EU, the UK had the advantage of around 40 trade agreements. These deals covered over 70 countries and allowed for tariff-free or reduced tariff trading. It was smooth sailing for UK businesses that wanted to trade internationally. But post-Brexit, the UK had to renegotiate these agreements independently. While some deals were successfully rolled over, many were not. This led to gaps, delays, and disruptions in trade. Take the UK's trade deal with Japan, for example. It went into effect in January 2021, but it was mostly just a continuation of the EU-Japan deal. There wasn't much new in it to benefit the UK, and then there's the UK's first unique trade deal with Australia. According to the UK government's own estimate, this agreement will boost UK exports and imports by only about 0.4% each year over the next 15 years, with the impact on GDP being just 0.1%. Not exactly a game changer, right? Negotiating trade deals is tricky and takes a lot of time, and the UK has faced a few key challenges. As part of the EU, the UK had the muscle of 27 countries behind it, making it easier to get favorable terms. But as a single nation, it's harder to negotiate strong deals. The UK simply doesn't have the same influence as the EU's massive collective market. Post-Brexit, the UK started setting its own rules and regulations separate from the EU. While this sounds like freedom, it actually complicates things for businesses that trade with both the UK and the EU. But now they have to comply with two different sets of rules, which increases costs and discourages trade. Plus, the UK needed new trade agreements fast to avoid trade disruptions. But rushed negotiations aren't always the best, and in some cases, speed may have come at the cost of quality and the details in the deal. So, what's all this actually meant for the UK economy? The answer? Quite a bit. The Centre for European Reform estimates that leaving the single market and customs union reduced the UK's trade in goods by £10 billion, or 13.5% in May 2021 alone. That's a huge drop and shows just how much trade was impacted by Brexit-related changes. While the EU has continued to grow its trade partnerships, the UK hasn't kept pace. Take the EU-Canada trade agreement known as CETA, which started in 2017. This boosted trade between the EU and Canada. The UK, on the other hand, had to negotiate its own deal with Canada, which only took effect in 2021. During that gap, UK businesses missed out on the benefits of preferential access to the Canadian market. The Centre for European Reform also pointed out that the UK missed out on significant European trade growth due to these added border costs from Brexit. It's like having to pay a toll every time you cross the border with goods, adding up quickly. Not all industries are impacted equally. Some are hit harder than others. Here are a couple of examples. With Brexit, the UK left the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, which supported its farmers, plus the loss of EU trade agreements means higher tariffs on agricultural exports. UK farmers are finding it harder to compete in key markets because their products now come with higher costs, making them less attractive compared to European products. Now, while good trading has hit some bumps, there's a twist in the story. Services are shining brighter than ever. The value of what the UK sells in services like banking, tech, and legal advice has started to outshine the value of goods sold abroad. By 2023, services exports reached £470 billion, which is 25% higher than goods exports, which were at £377 billion. Trading goods now comes with more rules, checks, and costs, making it tougher for UK manufacturers to compete globally. But here's where the services sector has a secret weapon. Many services, like finance and tech, aren't as affected by these physical border checks. They can be delivered across borders with a click, giving the UK a major advantage in this area. The UK services sector has been built on some powerhouse industries. Think of big financial hubs like London. This city is famous for its banks, law firms, and technology companies. Legal services, financial advice, and IT solutions are areas where the UK excels, and businesses around the world turn to the UK for these services. This success in services is a bright spot for the UK, but it also reveals a bigger story. The drop in goods trading is causing ripple effects across the UK, especially in manufacturing-heavy areas like the Midlands and Northern England. These regions rely more on factories and goods production, so they've been hit harder by the new trade barriers. It's creating a wider gap between different parts of the country. London and the South, with their focus on services, are doing well, while manufacturing regions face tougher times. The City of London Cooperation reports that Brexit has cost around 40,000 jobs in London's financial industry as companies move to cities like Dublin, Milan, and Paris. Here's another twist. In 2023, the UK faced a trade deficit with the EU of £95 billion. A trade deficit means the UK is importing more than it's exporting, so that imbalance has grown as the goods sector faces more obstacles. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, Brexit could reduce the UK's trade intensity by a huge 15%. But what's trade intensity about? In simpler terms, a higher trade intensity means more global business, but a lower one signals fewer international connections and often more isolation. When trade intensity is high, the economy is booming, filled with bustling exchanges of goods, services, and ideals across borders. But when it drops, it's a sign that things are slowing down. Less trade can mean fewer products, less capital, and fewer cutting-edge technologies flowing into the country. And with the UK's trade intensity expected to fall by such a substantial amount, it's clear that Brexit has nudged the UK toward a less connected economic path. With all the uncertainty about the UK's trade future, foreign investments have taken a hit as well. In fact, inward foreign direct investment dropped by a massive £12.3 billion in 2020. This was the first drop in FDI since 2008, which meant there's less money fueling the UK's trade and economy. This drop in trade intensity has ripple effects on the whole economy. The OBR estimates that the UK's productivity could fall by 4% over the long term. Lower productivity usually means slower wage growth and lower living standards for everyday people. When the UK voted to leave the EU in 2016, the pound went on a wild ride, creating big challenges for anyone buying or selling products internationally. After the Brexit vote, the pound experienced its largest one-day drop in 30 years, a massive 8% fall against the US dollar. Markets were reacting to the unexpected result and the fear of what leaving the EU would mean for the UK's future. Over the years of back-and-forth negotiations that followed, this uncertainty kept the pound bouncing up and down. By early 2021, the pound was about 15% weaker against the euro compared to where it was just before the referendum in 2016. Currency volatility, or rapid changes in the value of a currency, can be a headache for companies trading across borders, and it affects them in several ways. Imagine trying to set prices when the currency keeps changing. If the pound's value drops, UK goods become cheaper for foreign buyers, which can be a good thing for exports. But it also means that anything the UK imports becomes more expensive, which can hurt local businesses that rely on foreign raw materials. On the flip side, if the pound suddenly rises, UK goods get more costly for buyers abroad, potentially lowering sales while imports get cheaper. For businesses working with tight profit margins, sudden currency swings can be brutal. If a business isn't prepared with strategies to protect against these changes, a quick drop in the pound's value can eat away at its profits. When the currency is unstable, businesses may hesitate to invest or expand. Imagine planning a big project but having no idea what the currency value will be by the time it's finished. It's risky. This unpredictability often leads to a cautious approach where companies put off investments until things settle down. Unsurprisingly, UK businesses are feeling uneasy about this situation, especially when they're dealing with new regulations and extra paperwork. With no clear idea of what the currency will do next, financial planning becomes a bit like guesswork. And so, in the pile of all the terrible things Brexit led to, trade in the UK continues to get worse with every passing day.